This is How to Teach History, the Compromise of 1850 role play. So our anticipatory set that you can share with your students is when you have to negotiate or compromise with someone, what is the best strategy and why? Things that you might want to discuss with your students, they can bring up their own topics of things you might want to discuss. For example, is it better to speak first or to listen first? Is it better to be the person that's driving the conversation or is it better to be the person listening? Which one do you think and why? Is it better to be strong and drive a hard bargain or is it better to be flexible and why? And is it a good idea to threaten the opponent with walking away from the bargaining table, or should you let them know you're not willing to leave until a fair deal is struck, and why? That's our anticipatory set. All right, so this is our one note for the day before we get to the end. Just very, very simple here. Obviously, this is overly simplistic, but it'll help the students get the idea. The Compromise of 1850, basic background, the United States had a problem with sectionalism. This means that Americans often identify themselves as Northerners or Southerners and dislike the other side. That's about as much as I give the students before we go into the role play. All right, so what you're going to do, it's pretty simple here. You're just going to divide the class into pairs of two. Obviously, if there's an odd number, two people, you can have two Southerners or two Northerners. In each group, have one student is going to play a Northerner and one student is going to play a Southerner. They must compromise about four issues that you're going to see on the next slides and write down their solutions. What they come up with is very simple. Most of the class is going to be them debating with each other in groups. All right, and as an option, this is I do this often in class, but this is something of a risk. I like to interject game theory into social studies classes. I like to, as you're going to see in a second, I like to make students think that have some skin in the game, so to speak. I want to tie their grades into these historical role plays, so they really want to win. All right, so the option is to use game theory and play a variation of the prisoner's dilemma. You can look that up for yourself if you don't know what that is. With the students, it's a great thing for the students to understand. Each of the four issues count for 25% of the student's grades. If the student wins an issue by getting the better end of the bargain, that is determined entirely by you. You'll just say who won or who lost. They get an A for that issue. If the student loses by getting the worst end of the bargain, they get a C for that issue. And if the students cannot compromise at all on an issue, explain that they may have just caused a civil war, and they both receive Fs for that issue. That's a variation on the prisoner's dilemma. That's not the way the traditional prisoner's dilemma works. But I think it would work for this kind of class. Of course, you can change the grades to whatever you want. Another big thing for this option is to, frankly, to lie to the students, to say that's going to affect their grade, but then just give everybody an A for participating and debating in good faith and writing their answers down anyway. Also, something I've been known to do. I have students like, oh my God, am I going to fail? Am I going to fail? And at the end, I'm like, no, I was just trying to motivate you. So a lot of different options there. Do what you think is best. All right. So if the student is a northerner, I'm going to give them the following kind of worksheet, or you can give them oral. You can tell them this orally, however you want to do it. All right. Maybe you want to break the class down, and each will have this PowerPoint, whatever you want to do. So this is what I give them and what I gave my students as a worksheet. If students in Northerner, here are quick directions. The one for the South is going to be very similar. Today you'll be playing a character from the past. You'll be pretending that you are a Northerner who does not like slavery. Just critical that they know that the North was, while they weren't, you never want to make them, you don't want to exaggerate, and Northerners were very, very racist. They were overwhelmingly against slavery. All right, so your job is to compromise with the other side, to compromise a situation where the two sides don't agree. This is really basic stuff. In order to avoid a fight, they're going to give up something to get something, and your goal is to try to give up as little as possible and get as much as possible. Read the following four pieces of text that I'm going to go over with you, and then compromise with your partners until you reach an agreement. Write down what you agree to. That's the critical thing. Make sure that whatever they come up with, they are writing it down. All right. So the four things that the Northerners, are going to be negotiating on, and here are their positions. First, they think California should be a free state. Why? California's people said that slavery wouldn't work there. Seems pretty clear to me. If the people of California don't want something, then why should it exist there? The people there are trying to mine for gold, and slaves can't be trusted around gold mines. So if you're a Northerner, that's your argument. All right, number two, slavery should not be allowed in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is the nation's capital. It's America's most important city where the president lives. It's embarrassing to call ourselves the freest country in the world, but have slavery where we meet important members of other countries. We're doing international business and we're saying we're the greatest country in the world, and literally right outside the White House, you can see people being bought and sold in auctions. It's kind of embarrassing. To Northerners, it only makes sense that we should get rid of slavery in Washington, D.C. Three, the fugitive slave law is terrible and should not be followed. And from our perspective, from the northern perspective, the fugitive slave law deals with runaway slaves. The law says that the police are allowed to go onto people's property. Federal police, some far off federal policeman you've never met before in your whole life, says the police are allowed to go on your property and search for these runaways without your permission. It also says that the police can force people to look for the slaves too, and if they don't help when the police ask, they can go to jail. That's unfair. All right, students really connect with this one. They really don't like the fugitive slave law, so they can really, it's pretty easy to see how ugly this law was. All right, this is a big weakness, although for the when they find out it's actually in the Constitution, the South's going to bring that up in later, as the Northerners will sadly find out. But you don't have to tell them that. All right, and lastly, Texas should not own New Mexico. Texas is trying to be even bigger than it already is. Silly Texas. Texas is saying that they should own the land in New Mexico too. It seems kind of greedy. New Mexico should not only be its own state, but it should also be free, not slave. New Mexico is made up of desert lands where slave plantations wouldn't work anyway. All right, so those are the northern arguments. These are the arguments that the students need to read, well, and be aware of why they should get what they want and why they're right. All right, let's do the opposite. You can give the Southerners this worksheet and do the same thing with them. Directions, again, you're playing a character from the past. You're pretending that you're a Southerner who likes slavery. Also, again, important to note that you don't want to over exaggerate. While most Southerners did like slavery, most Southerners did not own slaves, so make sure that they know that. But most Southerners did believe in slavery, and most Southerners thought it was very essential to their way of life. Again, your job is to compromise. The same thing as the Northerners, and it's the same thing. Read the following text, then compromise and write it down. All right, so why do the Southerners think they're right and what are their position on their issues? So, number one, California should be at least half slave and half free. And why? In the Compromise of 1820, the North made an agreement with you. They promised that the country would be split in half. Anything below a line called 3630 would be a slave state, and half of California is below this line. A promise is a promise. Pretty decent argument. Congress already settled this problem in the Compromise of 1820. We're just asking you to follow that compromise. Seems pretty reasonable from the South's point of view. Two, slavery should remain in Washington, D.C. Well, it's tradition. Slavery had been legal in our nation's capital since America was created. We've been doing this for 60 years. That's our right to have slavery there. It also happens to be below 3630, and there's just no reason why our way of life and our tradition should not be allowed to be shown off to the world. Yeah, you might be embarrassed by slavery, but we're not. It's our way of life. This is the way it's always been. Why should we have to give up anything on Washington, D.C.? All right, three, the fugitive slave law should be stronger. Fugitive slave law, this is very much what we talk about with the North, but you're explaining to the Southerners. It says that Northerners must help return runaway slaves to their Southern owners. The fugitive slave law is a part of the nation's Constitution, which is the highest rule book of the United States. The law has existed since America has existed, and right now, many Northerners are refusing to follow the law. This makes getting back your valuable property almost impossible. Northerners who don't follow this law should be punished. Right now, they break the law and usually get away with it. This is absolutely outrageous. And lastly, New Mexico should be a part of Texas and have slavery. Texas fought very bravely against Mexico to gain its land. Texas is right next to New Mexico. The United States should allow Texas to expand its borders and have the lands in New Mexico be a part of it. And of course, if New Mexico is a part of Texas, then it would be a more slave territory. Only natural. All right, so those are the arguments back and forth. You're going to let the kids do most of the talking in their groups, and they're going to negotiate back and forth, and then they're going to write their solutions down. That might take an entire period, depends how long your periods are, and then we're going to get to the group conversation and assignment. All right, so a review in our assignment. You're going to share the actual provisions of the Compromise of 1850 with the students and have them copy them down. Um, these shouldn't always stress, make the notes very, very short. If anything, you might even just want to give them a worksheet with the actual compromise or just use their textbook. You don't want to spend a ton of time having them take notes. It might just be 4 or 5 provisions that you do very quickly. Then you're going to debate and discuss, always critical. I always grade these debates and discussions. I write the student's name on the board as they're discussing when they're talking about their opinions and give them credit. For each provision in the actual compromise, do you think the North or the South got the better end of the deal, or was it about even, and why? And then lastly, once you've done all 4 provisions, which side, if any, won this compromise in total? Did the North win the compromise of 1850? Did the South win? Why? And then finally, write a 2 to 3 paragraph short paper. Compare your role play compromise to the actual compromise of 1850. Was your compromise more similar or more different to the actual compromise? Explain. So, did the solutions you came up with, were they more similar or more different? Was your compromise more fair and evenly balanced for both sides than the actual compromise, or not? And explain with evidence. And finally, in your opinion, was the actual compromise of 1850 an effective one or not, and why? And I don't want to give too much away to the students, but my big question, what I'm leaning towards here is, did this do a decent job? If you didn't know what would happen in the future, obviously the students probably know that the Civil War happened, but if you didn't know that the Civil War was coming, if you didn't have the benefit of hindsight, do you think this is a decent compromise to get the North and the South to stop fighting, stop arguing with each other, or do you think it's a bad compromise, and why?